Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're all about taking complex topics and making them, well, not so complex. Cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of the matter. And today we're diving into something pretty fundamental to all of us, really. Aging.
But it's not just about aging, right? We're also talking about longevity. And as you'll see, there's a really interesting distinction between the two. And that difference, it matters. It matters a lot, especially if you're trying to make sense of all the health and wellness information out there.
Absolutely. And we've got a great stack of sources to help us unpack all of this. We're looking at research from the Aging and Longevity Journal out of Ukraine. They're dedicated to, as you might guess, the science of getting older.
We're also tapping into the Huberman Lab. They've done some really interesting work on the science behind aging and, how we might actually be able to influence it.
And last but not least, a really insightful paper from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. They make a strong case for why understanding the difference between aging and longevity is so important, especially when it comes to nutrition research.
So our mission today, to distill the key differences between aging and longevity and figure out what those differences mean for us, especially as we think about how to support our health as we get older.
Perfect. So let's start with the basics. The NIH paper gives us some definitions, right? Let's start with biological aging. How do they define that?
Well, they describe it as a progressive, event-dependent decline in the ability to maintain biochemical/physiological function. Kind of like a machine slowly losing efficiency over time, right?
Okay, that makes sense. So then how does longevity differ from that?
Longevity is basically the length of the lifespan independent of the biological aging process. So aging is about the decline, and longevity is just about how long you live, regardless of that decline.
So it's not about whether you decline, it's about how long it all takes to,
Right, exactly. And of course, the rate at which our bodies decline, that will probably influence how long we live, right? It all gets a bit intertwined.
Definitely makes things tricky. Now, let's shift gears a bit. Why do we even have a limited lifespan in the first place? The NIH paper digs into this idea from an evolutionary perspective, looking at longevity. What's the main takeaway there?
It's actually pretty fascinating. The idea is that how long we live, our longevity, it's not just some random thing. It's been shaped by evolution. They reference a researcher, W.D. Hamilton, who basically showed that the genes that influence our lifespan were mainly selected for their benefits early in life, specifically for how they contribute to our survival and, successful reproduction.
So it's not that we have these special live forever genes that kick in later in life.
No, not really. The pressure from natural selection is strongest when we're young, trying to reach reproductive age and pass on those genes. Once we've done that, the evolutionary push to, keep us functioning at our peak for decades and decades, it kind of weakens.
Makes sense. Evolution's all about passing on those genes, right? So once you've reproduced.
Exactly. And the paper mentions these fruit fly experiments. Scientists bred fruit flies to reproduce later in life, and guess what? Those flies actually ended up living longer. Supports the whole idea that longevity is tied to that, evolutionary drive to reproduce.
Wow, so fascinating. Okay, so longevity has this evolutionary explanation tied to reproduction. But what about aging itself? The NIH paper actually suggests that aging isn't really a product of direct evolutionary selection, which seems like a huge distinction.
It is, and to understand this, they bring up Peter Medawur's mutation accumulation theory. Basically, genes with negative effects that only show up later in life, they might accumulate because natural selection wouldn't be strong enough to weed them out, especially if they don't mess with reproduction.
So they're like hidden bad genes that slip through the cracks because they don't cause problems until after we've already had kids.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But the NIH paper also points out that Medawur, he didn't always differentiate between aging and longevity very clearly. His work was more about explaining how long we live rather than, the actual process of decline itself.
Interesting. It really shows how important these definitions are. So if these late-acting genes aren't the primary drivers of aging, what is? The NIH paper mentions something called Kirkwood's disposable soma theory of aging. What's that all about?
It's an interesting one. Kirkwood's theory suggests that our bodies have limited resources, and they prioritize those resources for the germline, our reproductive cells. That's how our genes survive. The soma, which is basically everything else, our muscles, organs, our brain, all of that, it's kind of considered disposable after we reproduce.
Disposable. Seems kind of harsh, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it does sound a bit grim. But it's all about efficiency from an evolutionary standpoint. Maintaining our DNA, repairing cellular damage, all that takes energy. And so the theory is, if an organism has to choose where to invest those limited resources, evolution favors the germline, making babies, passing on those genes. And as a result, the rest of the body, the somatic cells, they get less investment in the long term. And that leads to, well, to aging.
So we're designed to last just long enough to pass on those genes. Anything beyond that is kind of like bonus time.
Yeah, that's a simplified way of looking at it, but you get the idea. The main focus of evolution is gene transmission. Keeping our bodies in tip-top shape long after we've reproduced just isn't as high on the priority list.
Fascinating stuff. Now, another key point from the NIH paper is that chance or randomness plays a big role in aging too. How does that fit in with these other theories about evolution and resource allocation?
Oh, that's a really important point. They highlight that aging is largely a random process, what scientists call stochastic. It's tied to entropy, that whole idea that the universe tends towards disorder over time. Like a car gradually getting dents and scratches, but in unpredictable places.
Right, entropy. So the universe is always kind of leaning towards things breaking down.
Yeah, that's it. And our bodies are constantly fighting that, using energy to maintain order and repair that damage that happens naturally. Making it to reproductive age suggests your genes are pretty good at keeping things in order. But, well, there's no evolutionary pressure to maintain that perfect order forever, right? So the gradual decline in our ability to fight that disorder, that shows up as the unpredictable declines we see with aging.
So it's not like we're all programmed to age at the same rate and in the same way.
Exactly. And that randomness makes it really hard for researchers to come up with broad nutritional recommendations for older adults because everyone's aging a bit differently. The data gets really messy.
Makes sense. You can't just study one group and assume it'll apply to everyone, especially if everyone's aging a bit differently on a fundamental level. The paper even uses the example of antioxidant supplements, right? How those initial promising results kind of fizzled out in larger studies.
Yeah, exactly. Early research, often in, lab settings or small groups, it seemed like antioxidant supplements might help fight damage and maybe even slow down aging. And sometimes population studies kind of hinted at benefits from diets high in antioxidants, but then large, well-controlled trials. The benefits for the average older person often didn't really pan out.
So it's really hard to find universal solutions for something that's so influenced by chance and individual variation. Huh?
Yeah, that's the challenge. Now, this all brings up a really important question. What does this difference between aging and longevity mean for nutrition research? The NIH paper makes a pretty strong argument
here.
here.
Yeah, let's get into that. What are they suggesting?
Their main point is that understanding this fundamental difference is crucial for designing good nutrition research that actually helps older adults. They say if the goal is to impact lifespan, longevity, then maybe the research should focus on how specific nutrients interact with the genes that influence survival and reproduction.
So looking for specific gene-nutrient interactions that could help us live longer.
Exactly. But if the goal is to use nutrition to directly slow down the aging process itself in older adults to tackle that unpredictable decline, well, the NIH paper suggests that might be a much tougher path because aging is so random.
Because you're trying to hit a moving target.
Right. So instead, they propose shifting the focus, looking at how variations in younger people potentially influenced by their nutrition might make them more or less likely to age in certain ways down the line.
Interesting. So focusing on what happens early in life to shape how we age later on. They even bring up the fetal origins hypothesis, which suggests that the conditions in the womb can have long-term health consequences.
Right. The fetal origins hypothesis usually focuses on how things in early life, like nutrition during pregnancy, can increase the risk of certain diseases later in life. But the NIH paper is suggesting we broaden that concept to see if early nutrition might also influence the rate of aging itself. Maybe making some people more resilient to those random processes as they get older.
So maybe the most impactful nutritional strategies for healthy aging aren't about what we do when we're 70, but what happened when we were just developing.
Exactly. Now, let's bring in our other sources. The Aging and Longevity Journal, even in its introduction, stresses how vast and complex the field of aging really is. They talk about the need for new ideas and a more diverse, interdisciplinary approach to really understand it all.
And they also point out something pretty striking. Despite centuries of studying aging, the practical recommendations for healthy aging haven't really changed all that much.
Yeah, it shows just how tough it is to find effective and, universal interventions. Now, the Huberman Lab, they take a different angle. They acknowledge that we can't stop aging, but they focus on things we can do, lifestyle changes that might help slow it down and extend our health span, those years of healthy, active life.
So while the NIH paper highlights the challenges of trying to use nutrition to directly target the aging process in older adults, the Huberman Lab is all about these broader lifestyle interventions, things that might build our overall resilience. Things like reducing inflammation and supporting cellular health through diet and exercise.
Right. It's about making our internal environment as strong and healthy as possible so that we can better handle, the wear and tear of time. They talk about cellular senescence, where cells basically lose their ability to divide and function properly, and how lifestyle choices might influence that process.
Okay, so let's bring this all together for our listeners. What are the big takeaways from our deep dive today?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that fundamental difference between longevity and aging. Longevity has a strong evolutionary and genetic basis, largely driven by genes that help us survive until we reproduce. Aging, on the other hand, is a more random process. It's about our bodies gradually losing their ability to maintain themselves over time.
And that distinction is super important for how we think about nutrition research, especially for older adults.
Exactly. Trying to come up with universal nutritional recommendations to reverse or slow down aging in older adults, it's going to be tricky because aging is so random and individual. The NIH paper suggests that research might be more effective if it focuses on how our genes and metabolism, maybe influenced by early life nutrition, shape how we age later on.
So instead of looking for a magic bullet to fix aging later in life, maybe it's about building a strong foundation early on.
Right. Now, of course, taking care of ourselves throughout our lives is important. That's where those Huberman Lab recommendations come in. But the NIH paper makes a strong case for thinking about the long game, how what we do early on might influence how we age later.
It's definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
So for you listening, think about your own health journey. What do you think has had the biggest impact on how you're aging today? Maybe things that happened in your childhood or even in your younger years. And more importantly, what do you have the power to change moving forward?
That's a great question to ponder. We can't change the past, but understanding how aging works can help us make better choices throughout our lives. The science of aging is constantly evolving, and while we can't stop time, knowing more about how it works can definitely help us navigate the journey better.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, that's a wrap for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explore the fascinating and complex world of aging and longevity. See you next time.